lit the same candle every night, not out of habit, but because she believed something would return. What was she waiting for? And why did she never stop? Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story, and where you're watching from, and why you're following this. The wind howled through the narrow streets of Windermere, a small village nestled in the northern reaches of England, where the cold seemed to seep into the very bones of those who called it home. The year was 1347, and the village existed under the shadow of Castle Greystone, the imposing fortress that belonged to Lord Hadrian Ashford, a nobleman known throughout the region for his iron fist and unyielding nature. The castle's gray stone walls rose against the darkening sky like ancient sentinels, their surfaces weathered by centuries of rain and snow, while torches flickered in the guard towers, casting dancing shadows across the courtyard below. In a modest stone cottage at the edge of the village, separated from the main square by a winding dirt path that turned to mud with every rainfall, lived a woman whose beauty was spoken of in hushed whispers throughout the land. Eleanor Whitmore was her name, and at 23 years of age, she possessed features that seemed carved by the hands of master artisans. Her hair fell in waves of deep chestnut brown, cascading past her shoulders like a waterfall of silk, catching the firelight in shades of amber and gold. Her eyes were the color of the forest in spring, a brilliant green that held depths of sorrow and hope intertwined, framed by long lashes that cast delicate shadows on her high cheekbones. Her skin was fair, though not the porcelain white of noble women who never saw the sun, but rather the healthy glow of someone who had known both labor and laughter. She wore a dress of deep burgundy wool, its sleeves long and fitted, with a leather belt cinched at her waist, and over her shoulders rested a cloak of thick gray fur, necessary protection against the biting cold that never truly left these northern lands. Eleanor lived alone now, though her cottage still bore the marks of a life once shared. Her husband, Thomas, a blacksmith of considerable skill and gentle heart, had died 3 years prior in a riding accident while returning from delivering weapons to a neighboring lord's garrison. The loss had shattered something fundamental within Eleanor, leaving her adrift in a world that suddenly felt vast and empty. Every evening, without fail, she would light a single candle and place it in the window facing the road that led to the village center, a beacon of hope that somehow, impossibly, Thomas might find his way back to her. The rational part of her mind knew this was foolishness, that the dead did not return, that her husband lay buried in the churchyard beneath a simple stone marker. Yet the heart, Eleanor had learned, did not always bend to reason, and so she waited, night after night, for a miracle that would never come. The cottage itself was small but well kept, with a stone hearth that dominated one wall, its fire crackling softly and sending waves of warmth into the single room that served as both living quarters and sleeping chamber. Dried herbs hung from the wooden beams overhead, their scent mingling with the smell of burning wood and the faint aroma of bread that Eleanor had baked earlier in the day. A simple wooden table occupied the center of the room, surrounded by 2 chairs, though Eleanor only ever used one now. In the corner stood a bed covered with layers of wool blankets and furs, necessary defenses against the brutal winters that could kill the unprepared. The walls were adorned with little decoration, save for a small wooden cross above the door, and a faded tapestry depicting a hunting scene that had belonged to Thomas's mother. Eleanor spent her days doing what work she could find in the village. She had learned the art of herbalism from her mother, who had possessed knowledge of plants and their properties that bordered on the uncanny. The villagers came to her for remedies when they fell ill, for salves when they burned themselves, for tinctures to help them sleep or to ease the pain of old wounds. She charged little for her services, often accepting payment in the form of bread, cheese, or firewood, and sometimes asking for nothing at all when she knew a family had little to spare. This generosity had earned her a reputation as a kind soul, though there were those among the more superstitious villagers who viewed her knowledge of herbs with suspicion, whispering that perhaps her skills came from darker sources than mere learning. On this particular evening, as autumn began its slow surrender to winter, Eleanor sat by her window, the candle burning steadily in its pewter holder. She wore a simple nightdress beneath her fur-lined robe, her hair unbound and flowing freely down her back. In her lap rested a piece of embroidery, a project she had started months ago but never seemed to finish, her needle moving through the fabric with practiced ease, even as her mind wandered to distant memories. Outside, The wind rattled the shutters and sent swirls of dead leaves dancing through the darkening streets. The sun had set an hour ago, painting the sky in shades of purple and gray before surrendering entirely to the night. A knock at the door startled Eleanor from her reverie, causing her to prick her finger with the needle. She brought the wounded digit to her lips, tasting the metallic tang of blood before setting aside her embroidery and rising to answer. Visitors at this hour were unusual, though not unheard of. Sometimes a mother would come seeking medicine for a feverish child, or an elderly villager would need something to ease their aching joints. Eleanor pulled her robe tighter around herself and lifted the heavy wooden bar that secured the door, pulling it open to reveal an unexpected sight. Standing in the doorway was a man who could only be described as formidable. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders that seemed to fill the entire frame of the entrance, and a presence that commanded immediate attention. His face was striking, with a strong jaw covered in dark stubble, a straight nose that had clearly been broken at least once, and eyes of the most unusual shade of gray, like storm clouds gathering before rain. His hair was black as a raven's wing, falling to his shoulders in waves that suggested it had been some time since he had visited a barber. He wore the clothing of a soldier, though finer than what common men-at-arms typically possessed. His tunic was of dark green wool, embroidered at the collar and cuffs with subtle patterns in silver thread, and over this he wore a leather jerkin reinforced with metal studs. A heavy cloak of black fur hung from his shoulders, clasped at the throat with a brooch bearing a falcon in flight, and at his hip hung a sword in a worn leather scabbard, its pommel wrapped in silver wire. His boots were of good leather, mud-splattered from travel, and his gloved hands bore the calluses of a man accustomed to wielding weapons. "Forgive the intrusion at this late hour," the stranger said, his voice deep and resonant, carrying the cultured accent of someone who had been educated in noble courts. "I am told you are Eleanor Whitmore, the herbalist?" Eleanor studied him cautiously, her hand still resting on the door, ready to close it if necessary. "I am," she replied, her own voice steady despite the surprise she felt. "And who might you be, sir, to come calling when decent folk are preparing for sleep?" A slight smile touched the corner of the man's mouth, though it did not quite reach his eyes. "My name is Sir Rowan Steele, sworn sword to Lord Ashford of Castle Greystone. I serve as captain of his household guard, and I come on a matter of some urgency." He paused, as if weighing his next words carefully. "There has been an incident at the castle. One of the Lord's servants, a young woman named Catherine, has fallen gravely ill. The castle physician has done what he can, but she grows worse with each passing hour. Lord Ashford sent me to fetch you, believing your knowledge of herbs might succeed where traditional medicine has failed." Eleanor felt her heart quicken at the mention of Lord Ashford. The nobleman was known to be a harsh master, quick to anger and slow to forgive. His summons were not requests but commands, and refusing would likely bring consequences she could ill afford. Yet the thought of leaving her cottage, of abandoning her vigil by the window, filled her with an inexplicable dread that tightened around her chest like iron bands. "I am no physician, Sir Rowan," Eleanor said carefully. "I have some knowledge of healing plants, it is true, but I cannot promise miracles. If your lord's own physician cannot help this woman, I doubt my simple remedies would prove more effective." Rowan's expression hardened slightly, though not with anger but with something that looked almost like desperation. "Nevertheless, you must come. The girl is barely 20 years old and she has no family to speak for her. If there is even the smallest chance your knowledge could save her life, would you not try?" He took a step closer, his gray eyes searching Eleanor's face. "I am told you are a woman of compassion, Mistress Whitmore. Surely you would not turn your back on someone in need, whatever your personal reservations might be." Eleanor felt the weight of his words settle over her like a mantle of responsibility. She thought of the young woman lying ill in the castle, suffering while others stood helplessly by. She thought of her own mother, who had never refused to help anyone who asked, regardless of the hour or the danger. And she thought of Thomas, who had always believed in doing what was right, even when it was difficult. "Very well," Eleanor said at last, stepping back from the door. "Give me a moment to gather my supplies and dress properly for travel. The night is cold, and the road to the castle is not a short one." Rowan nodded, relief evident in the relaxation of his shoulders. "I have horses waiting just outside the village. We can make the journey in less than half an hour if we ride swiftly." Eleanor moved quickly through her cottage, pulling on a warmer dress of thick wool in deep forest green, its sleeves lined with soft rabbit fur, and lacing up sturdy leather boots that reached to her knees. Over this she threw her warmest cloak, a heavy garment of brown wool lined with sheepskin, and around her neck she wrapped a scarf her mother had knitted years ago. She gathered her leather satchel, checking to ensure it contained all the essentials of her trade: dried foxglove for the heart, willow bark for pain and fever, chamomile for calming, yarrow for wounds, comfrey for inflammation, and dozens of other herbs and roots, each carefully labeled and stored in small cloth pouches. She added several glass vials of tinctures she had prepared, a mortar and pestle, and clean strips of linen for bandaging. As she worked, Eleanor was acutely aware of Rowan's presence in the doorway, his large frame silhouetted against the darkness outside. There was something about this man that unsettled her, though not in a way that suggested danger. Rather, it was the intensity with which he watched her, as if seeing something in her that others missed, and the careful courtesy with which he addressed her, so different from the gruff manner in which many soldiers spoke to common women. "You clearly take your craft seriously," Rowan observed, watching her methodical preparations. "Not many would keep their supplies in such meticulous order." "My mother taught me that in healing, as in many things, attention to detail can mean the difference between life and death," Eleanor replied, securing the flap of her satchel. "A medicine given in the wrong amount, or the right herb confused with a poisonous look-alike, and the patient dies rather than recovers. I cannot afford carelessness." "A wise philosophy," Rowan said. "I find the same is true in combat. A moment's inattention, a single misstep, and the battle is lost." Eleanor turned to face him fully, struck by the parallel he had drawn. "You speak as one who has seen much battle, Sir Rowan." His expression grew distant, as if looking at scenes only he could see. "More than I care to remember, Mistress Whitmore. I have fought in France and Scotland, and in a dozen petty conflicts between English lords who cannot seem to keep peace with their neighbors. War has a way of teaching lessons that cannot be learned any other way, though I would not wish such education on anyone." Before Eleanor could respond, she remembered her candle still burning in the window. She crossed to it quickly, her hand hesitating above the flame. For 3 years she had maintained this ritual without fail, and breaking it now felt like a betrayal of Thomas's memory, a surrender to the reality she had fought so hard to deny. "The candle," Rowan said softly, having followed her gaze. "You light it every night?" Eleanor nodded, unable to find words to explain the complicated emotions that churned within her. "For someone you lost?" Rowan asked, his voice gentle with understanding. "My husband," Eleanor whispered. "Thomas. He died 3 years ago, but still I wait, hoping somehow he might return." Rowan was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight of shared grief. "I understand such hope better than you might think. I lost someone dear to me as well, though under different circumstances. For a long time, I too waited for an impossible return, lighting not candles, but keeping watch from castle walls, searching every face that passed for the one I yearned to see again." Eleanor looked up at him, surprised by this unexpected revelation. "And did you eventually stop waiting?" "I learned that waiting for the impossible prevents us from seeing the possible," Rowan said carefully. "The dead we love would not wish us to remain frozen in grief, denying ourselves the chance to live fully again. That does not mean we forget them or love them less. It simply means we honor their memory by continuing to breathe, to hope, to open ourselves to whatever life might yet offer." His words struck Eleanor with unexpected force, resonating with thoughts she had harbored in her darkest moments but never dared voice. She looked down at the candle, its flame dancing steadily in the still air of the cottage, and made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. "The candle will be here when I return," she said quietly, and turned away from the window, picking up her satchel and nodding to Rowan. "I am ready. Let us go help this girl who needs us." The horses waited where Rowan had said, 2 magnificent destriers that stood patiently in the cold night air, their breath forming white clouds in the darkness. One was a massive black stallion that clearly belonged to the night, its coat gleaming like polished obsidian even in the dim light, while the other was a slightly smaller gray mare with intelligent eyes and a gentle disposition. Rowan helped Eleanor mount with practiced ease, his strong hands steadying her as she settled into the saddle, and she was grateful for the assistance despite her pride, as it had been some time since she had ridden. Thomas had owned a horse once, a sturdy brown gelding they had used for traveling to market, but she had sold it after his death, unable to bear the sight of the empty stable. They rode through the village at a measured pace, the horses' hooves clopping against the frozen earth, past cottages where candlelight flickered in windows and the smell of cooking fires drifted on the wind. Eleanor pulled her cloak tighter against the cold, feeling the bite of the wind against her exposed face. Above them, the sky was a tapestry of stars, brilliant points of light scattered across the darkness like diamonds cast upon black velvet, and the moon hung low and full, illuminating their path with its silvery glow. Once they cleared the village limits, Rowan urged the horses into a faster pace, and Eleanor found herself gripping the reins tightly as they galloped along the road that wound through the forest toward Castle Greystone. The trees rose on either side like ancient guardians, their bare branches reaching toward the sky in twisted patterns, and the sound of their passage echoed through the woods, accompanied by the rhythmic thunder of hoofbeats and the creak of leather. Eleanor had traveled this road before, though never at night and never with such urgency driving her forward. "Tell me about this girl, Catherine," Eleanor called out to Rowan, who rode slightly ahead of her, his form a dark silhouette against the moonlit path. "What are her symptoms? The more I know before we arrive, the better prepared I will be to help her." Rowan slowed his horse slightly, allowing Eleanor to draw alongside him. She began complaining of severe headaches 3 days ago, followed by fever and chills. Yesterday she started vomiting, unable to keep down even water, and this morning she began speaking incoherently, as if lost in fevered dreams. The physician bled her twice, believing she had an excess of ill humors, but she only grew weaker. By evening, she had fallen into a state where she barely responds to voices or touch, and her skin has taken on a grayish pallor that frightens even the hardened soldiers who guard her door. Eleanor's mind raced through the possibilities, sorting through everything her mother had taught her about illnesses and their treatments. Has anyone else in the castle fallen ill with similar symptoms? Is there any possibility she ingested something poisonous either by accident or design? "No one else has shown signs of illness," Rowan replied, his brow furrowed in thought. As for poison, the possibility occurred to Lord Ashford as well, which is partly why he wanted someone from outside the castle to examine her. Catherine is well liked among the servants, with no known enemies, but in a noble's household one can never be entirely certain of such things. There are always undercurrents of rivalry and jealousy running beneath the surface of daily life. "Then I will examine her thoroughly and see what can be determined," Eleanor said, though she felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach at the responsibility being placed upon her shoulders. If this girl died despite Eleanor's efforts, would Lord Ashford blame her? Would he accuse her of incompetence or worse? She pushed such thoughts aside, focusing instead on the task ahead. They rode in silence for a time, the only sounds the horses' labored breathing and the whisper of wind through the trees. Eleanor found herself stealing glances at Rowan, studying his profile in the moonlight. He sat his horse with the easy confidence of a man who had spent countless hours in the saddle, his posture straight despite the late hour and the urgency of their mission. There was something compelling about him, a combination of strength and what seemed like carefully controlled emotion, as if beneath his warrior's exterior lay depths he kept carefully hidden from the world. "You said you lost someone as well," Eleanor said, breaking the silence. "If it is not too presumptuous to ask, who was it that you waited for?" Rowan was quiet for so long that Eleanor began to think he would not answer. But finally he spoke, his voice carrying across the space between them like a confession whispered in the darkness. Her name was Isabel. She was the daughter of a merchant in London, beautiful and clever, with a laugh that could light up the darkest room. We were to be married, the arrangements all made, the church reserved. But 3 days before our wedding, plague struck the city. She fell ill on a Monday morning, and by Wednesday evening she was gone, along with her entire family. I was away on duty, serving in a minor skirmish near Dover, and I did not even have the chance to say goodbye. Eleanor felt her heart constrict with sympathy for this man's loss. "I am so sorry, Sir Rowan. To lose someone you love is terrible enough, but to be denied even the chance to bid them farewell must have been unbearable." "It was 5 years ago," Rowan said, though his voice suggested the wound had not entirely healed. "I threw myself into my duties afterward, took every dangerous assignment offered, fought in battles I had no stake in. hoping perhaps that I might join her in death. But I survived every conflict, every ambush, every moment when I should have fallen, and eventually I came to understand that perhaps I was being preserved for some purpose I had not yet discovered. That is when I accepted the position as Lord Ashford's captain of the guard and came to this northern territory to start anew. And have you found that purpose? Eleanor asked softly. Rowan turned to look at her, his gray eyes reflecting the moonlight. Perhaps I am beginning to, he said enigmatically, then gestured ahead. Look, we are approaching the castle. Castle Greystone rose before them like a massive shadow against the star-filled sky, its towers reaching upward as if attempting to pierce the heavens themselves. Torches burned along the battlements, creating points of flickering orange light that danced in the darkness, and Eleanor could see the silhouettes of guards moving along the walls, their spears and swords catching the firelight. The castle was built on a rocky outcrop that gave it a commanding view of the surrounding countryside, its walls thick and high, designed to withstand siege and assault. A moat surrounded the outer walls, its dark water reflecting the torchlight like liquid obsidian, crossed by a heavy wooden bridge that could be raised in times of danger. As they approached, guards called out challenges from the gatehouse, their voices sharp and suspicious in the night air. Rowan answered with practiced authority, identifying himself and his companion, and the massive iron-reinforced gates swung open with a groan of metal and wood. They rode into the outer courtyard, a large space paved with cobblestones, surrounded by stables, barracks, and various outbuildings necessary for the castle's operation. Servants and soldiers moved about despite the late hour, some carrying torches, others leading horses or hauling barrels and sacks. The air smelled of horses, hay, smoke, and cooking meat, the familiar sense of any large establishment. Rowan dismounted with fluid grace and moved to help Eleanor down, his hands firm and steady as they grasped her waist, lifting her from the saddle as if she weighed nothing at all. For a moment they stood close together, her hands resting on his shoulders for balance, and Eleanor felt an unexpected warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the nearby torches. She stepped back quickly, unsettled by the sensation, and Rowan released her with what might have been reluctance, though perhaps that was merely her imagination. "This way," he said, gesturing toward a heavy wooden door set into the inner wall. "Catherine has been moved to a chamber in the east wing, away from the other servants' quarters to prevent any possibility of contagion. Lord Ashford is waiting to speak with you before you examine her." Eleanor followed Rowan through the door and into the castle proper, entering a world of stone corridors lit by torches set in iron sconces. The walls were hung with tapestries depicting hunting scenes and great battles, their colors muted by age and smoke, and the floors were covered with rushes that rustled beneath their feet. Servants pressed themselves against the walls as Rowan passed, bowing their heads in deference to his rank, and Eleanor felt their curious eyes following her progress, no doubt wondering who this village woman was and why she had been summoned to the castle at such an hour. They climbed a winding stone staircase, their footsteps echoing in the narrow space, and emerged into a corridor lined with doors. Rowan led her to a chamber at the far end, where 2 guards stood watch, their faces grim and tired. He nodded to them, and they stepped aside, allowing him to push open the heavy oak door and usher Eleanor inside. The chamber beyond was large and well-appointed, clearly one of the better rooms in the castle despite being designated for a sick servant. A fire burned in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the walls, and several candles provided additional light. A large bed dominated one side of the room, its curtains pulled back to reveal a young woman lying motionless beneath layers of blankets. Standing near the window was a tall, thin man with gray hair and cold blue eyes, dressed in fine robes of deep purple wool trimmed with fur, a heavy chain of office hanging around his neck. This could only be Lord Hadrian Ashford himself. "My lord," Rowan said, bowing respectfully, "I have brought the herbalist as you commanded. This is Mistress Eleanor Whitmore of Wintermere Village." Eleanor curtsied deeply, keeping her eyes lowered in the presence of nobility. "My lord, I am honored by your summons, though I fear my skills may not be equal to the task you have set before me." Lord Ashford studied her with an intensity that made Eleanor acutely aware of her simple clothing and common origins. He was perhaps 50 years of age, with a face that had once been handsome, but was now lined with the marks of authority and displeasure. His mouth was set in a perpetual frown, and his eyes held the hardness of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Sir Rowan speaks highly of your knowledge of healing herbs," Lord Ashford said, his voice clipped and precise. "He tells me you have successfully treated ailments that baffled trained physicians. I hope for Catherine's sake that his confidence in you is justified. She has served in this household for 5 years and has been loyal and hard-working. I would see her restored to health if it is possible." Eleanor was surprised by the concern in the Lord's voice, having expected him to view a servant's life as of little consequence. Perhaps there was more to Lord Ashford than his stern reputation suggested, or perhaps Catherine held some special significance she did not yet understand. "I will do everything in my power to help her, my lord," Eleanor said. "But first I must examine her and determine the nature of her illness. May I approach?" Lord Ashford gestured toward the bed. "By all means. The physician has gone to rest, exhausted from his efforts. You have my permission to do whatever you deem necessary." Eleanor moved to the bedside, setting down her satchel and removing her cloak. The young woman lying before her was indeed, as Rowan had described, her skin pale and clammy, her breathing shallow and irregular. Catherine appeared to be in her early 20s, with blonde hair plastered to her forehead with sweat and delicate features twisted in discomfort, even in unconsciousness. Eleanor placed her hand on the girl's forehead, finding it burning with fever, then gently opened one of her eyes, noting that the pupil was dilated and slow to respond to light. "Has she been given anything to drink today?" Eleanor asked, not looking up from her examination. "We have tried," answered a soft voice from the corner, and Eleanor turned to see an older woman in servant's garb, her face creased with worry. "But she cannot keep anything down. Whatever we give her comes back up within minutes." Eleanor nodded, her mind working through the symptoms. Severe headache, fever, vomiting, confusion, now unconsciousness and dilated pupils. She had seen something similar once before, when a farmer's son had eaten nightshade berries as a child. But the progression was slower than typical poisoning, and there were elements that did not quite fit the pattern. "I need to smell her breath," Eleanor said, leaning close to Catherine's face and inhaling carefully. There was the sour smell of vomit and illness, but beneath that, something else, a faint bitter odor she could not quite identify. She examined Catherine's hands, noting the fingernails and the skin beneath them, then gently felt along her neck and beneath her jaw, finding the lymph nodes swollen and tender. "Sir Rowan, would you bring me the candle from the mantel?" Eleanor requested, and he complied immediately, holding the light close as she examined Catherine's throat, which appeared red and inflamed. Eleanor sat back on her heels, her brow furrowed in thought. The symptoms suggested several possibilities, some more treatable than others. "Well?" Lord Ashford demanded impatiently. "What ails her? Can you cure it?" Eleanor chose her words carefully. "My lord, I believe Catherine may be suffering from a severe inflammation of the brain, possibly caused by infection. The symptoms are consistent with what the ancient physicians called phrenitis, though the exact cause is difficult to determine without more information. However, there is also a possibility, albeit slight, that she may have been exposed to a toxic substance, though the progression suggests infection is more likely." "Can you treat it?" Lord Ashford asked again, his voice tight with tension. "I can try," Eleanor said honestly. "I have herbs that may reduce the fever and inflammation, and others that can help her body fight the infection. But my lord, I must be frank with you. If this is indeed what I suspect, the outcome is uncertain. Some recover fully, others suffer lasting damage, and some do not survive at all. The next 2 days will be critical." Lord Ashford's face hardened, but he nodded. "Then you will remain here in the castle and tend to her around the clock. Sir Rowan will ensure you have everything you need. Save her if you can, Mistress Whitmore. I am not a man who forgets those who serve him well, but neither do I forget those who fail me." The implied threat hung in the air like a drawn sword, but Eleanor refused to be intimidated. She had faced death before, had held her husband's hand as life left his body, and she would not be cowed by a nobleman's displeasure, however powerful he might be. "I understand, my lord," Eleanor said evenly. "Now, if you will excuse me, I must begin treatment immediately. Every moment we delay gives the illness more time to strengthen its hold." Lord Ashford departed shortly after Eleanor began her work, though not before issuing strict instructions to the guards and servants that she was to be given anything she requested without question or delay. The older servant woman, whose name Eleanor learned was Margaret, remained to assist, proving herself invaluable with her knowledge of the castle's resources and her genuine concern for Catherine's welfare. Rowan also stayed, positioning himself near the door, a silent presence that Eleanor found both comforting and somewhat distracting, though she could not have explained why his proximity affected her so. Eleanor worked quickly and methodically, drawing upon every scrap of knowledge her mother had imparted over the years. From her satchel she removed several pouches of dried herbs, laying them out on a table Margaret had cleared for her use. First, she prepared a tea from willow bark and feverfew, designed to reduce the dangerous fever that threatened to cook Catherine's brain in her own skull. She mixed the powdered bark with hot water Margaret brought from the kitchen, adding honey to make it more palatable, though she knew the unconscious girl would struggle to swallow anything. "Margaret, I need you to help me raise her head," Eleanor instructed, and together they carefully lifted Catherine into a semi-upright position, supporting her against pillows. Eleanor placed a small wooden spoon against the girl's lips, coaxing them open and allowing tiny amounts of the tea to trickle into her mouth. Catherine's throat worked reflexively, swallowing some of the liquid, though much of it dribbled down her chin. It was slow, painstaking work, but Eleanor persisted with patient determination, knowing that getting fluids and medicine into the girl was crucial to her survival. While the tea worked its way into Catherine's system, Eleanor prepared a poultice of comfrey and yarrow, plants known for their ability to reduce inflammation and fight infection. She mixed the powdered herbs with warm water until they formed a thick paste, then spread this mixture onto strips of clean linen. These she applied to Catherine's forehead, neck, and chest, changing them every hour as they cooled and lost their potency. The pungent smell of the herbs filled the chamber, mingling with the smoke from the fireplace and the lingering odor of sickness. "You work with great confidence," Rowan observed from his position near the door, watching Eleanor's precise movements with evident interest. "It is clear you have done this many times before." Eleanor glanced up from her work, wiping a strand of hair from her face with the back of her hand. "My mother was a healer before me, and her mother before her. I have been preparing medicines and treating the sick since I was old enough to grind herbs with a mortar and pestle. Though I confess I have never treated anyone under such scrutiny, with so much depending on the outcome." "You feel the weight of Lord Ashford's expectations," Rowan said, and it was not a question, but a statement of understanding. "How could I not?" Eleanor replied, mixing another batch of fever tea. "He made it quite clear that failure would not be forgiven, though I wonder at his concern for a servant girl. Most nobles would simply replace her and think nothing more of it." Rowan exchanged a glance with Margaret, who had been listening to their conversation while stoking the fire. The older woman seemed to debate with herself before speaking, then apparently decided that Eleanor deserved to know the full truth of the situation. "Catherine is not merely a servant, Mistress Whitmore," Margaret said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "She is Lord Ashford's daughter, born of a liaison with a servant woman who died in childbirth. The Lord has never publicly acknowledged her, cannot do so without causing scandal and potentially jeopardizing his position and legitimate heirs. But he has always ensured she was cared for, kept close, and protected. She knows who her father is, as do a few trusted members of the household, but the secret is carefully guarded." Eleanor felt a sudden rush of understanding, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Lord Ashford's unusual concern for a servant's welfare, the private chamber instead of the communal servants' quarters, the urgency with which he had summoned her. This was not just any sick girl, but his own flesh and blood, a daughter he could never claim but clearly loved nonetheless. "I see," Eleanor said softly. "Then the pressure to save her is even greater than I realized. A man may replace a servant, but he cannot replace a child, acknowledged or not." "Now you understand why Lord Ashford seemed so intense," Rowan said. "He has lost one child already, a son who died in infancy from his legitimate marriage. Catherine is all he has left, even if the world cannot know it. If she dies, it will break something in him that may never be repaired." Eleanor felt the weight of this revelation settle over her like a physical burden, but rather than crushing her spirits, it strengthened her resolve. She understood the pain of loss, knew intimately the empty ache that came from loving someone who had been torn away too soon. She would not allow Lord Ashford to suffer that agony if she had any power to prevent it, not for his sake but for Catherine's, and for the universal human need to protect those we love from the cruelty of an indifferent world. Throughout the long night, Eleanor maintained her vigil, administering medicines, changing poultices, and monitoring Catherine's condition with unwavering attention. Margaret dozed in a chair near the fire, exhausted from days of worry and lack of sleep, while Rowan remained alert, occasionally stepping out to confer with the guards or to fetch fresh water and supplies at Eleanor's request. As the hours passed, Eleanor found herself growing increasingly aware of Rowan's presence, the way he moved with quiet efficiency, the concern evident in his gray eyes when he looked at Catherine, the careful courtesy with which he addressed Eleanor herself. Near dawn, as the first gray light began to seep through the window shutters, Catherine's fever finally broke. Eleanor felt the change beneath her hand, the burning skin cooling to a more normal temperature, and she released a breath she had not realized she was holding. The girl's breathing also deepened, becoming more regular and less labored, and some of the terrible grayish pallor began to fade from her cheeks. "The fever has broken," Eleanor announced softly, and Margaret jerked awake, rushing to the bedside with tears of relief streaming down her weathered face. "Oh, blessed saints," the older woman breathed, clutching Eleanor's hand. "You have done it. You have saved her." "Not yet," Eleanor cautioned, though she allowed herself a small smile. "The fever breaking is a good sign, but the danger is not past. The next day will tell us whether she will recover fully or whether the illness has left lasting damage. We must continue the treatments and watch her carefully." Rowan approached the bed, looking down at Catherine with an expression of profound relief. "You have done well, Mistress Whitmore. When Lord Ashford hears of this, he will be greatly pleased." "I did only what anyone with knowledge would do," Eleanor said modestly, though she felt a warm glow of satisfaction at Rowan's praise. The herbs deserve the credit, and Catherine's own strength in fighting the infection. As if hearing her name, Catherine's eyelids fluttered, and for the first time in nearly 2 days, she opened her eyes. They were blue, Eleanor noted, the same shade as Lord Ashford's, confirming Margaret's revelation about her parentage. The girl's gaze was unfocused and confused, but it was conscious awareness, and that alone was cause for hope. "Where?" Catherine whispered, her voice cracked and barely audible. "What happened?" "Hush now," Eleanor said gently, smoothing the girl's damp hair back from her forehead. "You have been very ill, but you are going to recover. Do not try to talk. Just rest and let your body heal." Catherine's eyes drifted closed again, but her breathing remained steady and her color continued to improve. Eleanor prepared a nourishing broth from herbs and bone stock that Margaret brought from the kitchen, and over the next few hours, she managed to get several spoonfuls into Catherine, who kept it down without the violent rejection of previous attempts. Each small success built upon the last, and by the time the sun was fully risen, painting the chamber in shades of gold and amber, Eleanor felt confident enough to declare that Catherine would indeed survive. Lord Ashford arrived shortly after breakfast, bursting into the chamber with barely contained anxiety, his usually composed demeanor cracking to reveal the worried father beneath the stern nobleman's exterior. When he saw Catherine awake, sipping broth with Margaret's assistance, his face transformed with an emotion so raw and powerful that Eleanor had to look away, feeling as though she were intruding on an intensely private moment. "She will live?" Lord Ashford asked, his voice rough with suppressed feeling. "Yes, my lord," Eleanor confirmed. "The worst has passed. She will need continued care and rest for several weeks, but with proper treatment, she should make a full recovery." Lord Ashford closed his eyes briefly, and Eleanor could have sworn she saw moisture gathering in their corners before he blinked it away. When he opened them again, his gaze fixed on Eleanor with an intensity that made her shift uncomfortably. "You have done what I dared not hope was possible, Mistress Whitmore. Name your reward, and if it is within my power to grant, it shall be yours." Eleanor had not expected such an offer, and for a moment she stood speechless, her mind racing through possibilities. She could ask for gold, enough to ensure she never wanted for anything again. She could request land, or a position in the castle household, or any number of material benefits. But as she stood there, with Rowan's steady gaze upon her, and the morning light streaming through the windows, she realized that none of these things held any appeal. What she truly wanted could not be given by Lord Ashford or any other person, for it was the impossible return of her husband, the restoration of a life that had been taken from her. "I ask for nothing, my lord," Eleanor said finally. "I did only what any healer would do when faced with someone in need. To profit from another's suffering would dishonor my mother's teachings and my own conscience. Knowing that Catherine will recover is reward enough." Lord Ashford stared at her as if she had spoken in a foreign tongue, clearly unaccustomed to meeting people who did not seek to extract maximum advantage from every situation. Rowan, however, smiled slightly, a look of what might have been admiration crossing his features. "You are either the most foolish woman in England or the most noble," Lord Ashford said at last. "I choose to believe the latter. Nevertheless, I am not a man who enjoys being in debt, particularly to those who have rendered me such invaluable service. Therefore, I decree that you shall become the castle's official herbalist, with chambers here in Greystone, a generous salary, and the authority to requisition whatever supplies you need for your work. You will tend to the health of my household and have access to resources far beyond what you could obtain in your village." Eleanor opened her mouth to protest, to explain that she could not simply abandon her cottage and her life in Wintermere, but Lord Ashford raised his hand, forestalling her objections. "I am not asking, Mistress Whitmore. I am telling you how things will be. Your skills are too valuable to waste on minor village ailments when they could be employed in service to this household. Your cottage will be maintained in your absence, should you wish to visit, but your place is here now. Sir Rowan will see to your accommodations and ensure you have everything necessary to establish your practice within these walls." With that, Lord Ashford turned his attention to Catherine, approaching the bed with visible emotion, and taking her hand in his, speaking to her in low tones that Eleanor could not quite hear, but which carried unmistakable affection. Margaret beamed at Eleanor, clearly delighted by this turn of events, while Rowan's expression remained carefully neutral, though his eyes held a gleam that suggested he was not displeased by Lord Ashford's decree. Eleanor felt as though her world had shifted on its axis in the space of a single night. She had come to the castle expecting to spend a few hours treating a sick servant before returning to her simple life in the village, to her cottage and her candle, and her lonely vigil for a husband who would never return. Instead, she found herself thrust into a new existence, one that promised both opportunity and uncertainty in equal measure. The thought of leaving her cottage, of abandoning the nightly ritual that had defined her life for 3 years, filled her with a complicated mixture of relief and guilt that she could not fully process. "Come," Rowan said quietly, touching her elbow with gentle pressure. "Let me show you to your new chambers. You have been awake all night, and you need rest. Catherine is in good hands with Margaret, and Lord Ashford will not leave her side for some time. There is nothing more you can do here at present." Eleanor allowed herself to be guided from the chamber, too exhausted and overwhelmed to mount any protest. They walked through the castle corridors in silence, climbing another staircase to a higher floor where the living quarters were located. Rowan led her to a door near the end of the hallway and pushed it open, revealing a chamber far more spacious and well-appointed than Eleanor's entire cottage. The room was perhaps 3 times the size of her home in Wintermere, with a large bed covered in fine linens and furs, a fireplace already laid with wood and ready to be lit, a writing desk near the window, shelves for books and supplies, and even a separate small room that could serve as a workspace for preparing medicines. Eleanor stood in the doorway of her new chambers, momentarily unable to process the sudden transformation of her circumstances. The room before her represented a life so far removed from her simple existence in Wintermere that it might as well have belonged to a different world entirely. The bed alone, with its carved oak frame and layers of rich fabrics, was worth more than everything she owned combined. Thick tapestries hung on the walls, depicting pastoral scenes of shepherds tending their flocks and nobles hunting in verdant forests, their colors still vibrant despite obvious age. The stone floor was partially covered with woven rugs that would provide warmth against the winter cold, and the window, fitted with actual glass panes rather than simple shutters, offered a view of the castle courtyard and the countryside beyond. "I cannot accept this," Eleanor said, turning to face Rowan, who leaned against the doorframe watching her with an expression she could not quite decipher. "This is far too grand for someone of my station. Surely there are simpler quarters that would be more appropriate for a herbalist." Rowan shook his head, pushing away from the doorframe and entering the room. "Lord Ashford does nothing by half measures, Mistress Whitmore. When he bestows favor, he does so generously, and when he punishes, he does so severely. You have earned his gratitude by saving Catherine's life, and this is how he chooses to express it. To refuse would be to insult him, and I assure you that is not something you wish to do." Eleanor sank down onto a cushioned chair near the fireplace, suddenly aware of how utterly exhausted she was. The events of the night had drained her both physically and emotionally, and the shock of her changed circumstances threatened to overwhelm her already fragile composure. She had left her cottage expecting to return by morning, had left her candle burning in the window as she always did, a beacon of hope for an impossible return. Now she was being told she would not return at all, that her old life had ended and a new one had begun, whether she wished it or not. "What of my cottage?" Eleanor asked, her voice small and uncertain. "My belongings, my supplies, the life I built there. I will send men to retrieve whatever you wish to have brought here," Rowan assured her, kneeling beside her chair so that his eyes were level with hers. "Your cottage will be maintained, as Lord Ashford promised. You can visit whenever you like, though I suspect that once you settle into your new role, you will find little time for such journeys. The castle household is large, and there are always ailments to treat, injuries to tend, and medicines to prepare." Eleanor met his gaze, those storm-gray eyes that seemed to see far more than she was comfortable revealing. "And what of my choice in this matter? Am I to have no say in how my life unfolds?" Rowan's expression softened with something that looked like sympathy. "In truth, no. Lord Ashford is not a man who offers choices to those beneath his station. He commands, and we obey. But I would ask you to consider this, Eleanor." He used her given name for the first time, and the intimacy of it sent an unexpected shiver through her. "What life awaits you in Wintermere? Treating minor ailments for villagers who pay you in bread and firewood? Sitting alone each night, lighting a candle for a man who will never return? Slowly drowning in grief and loneliness? Is that truly preferable to this opportunity? To using your considerable skills in service of something greater? To being valued and compensated fairly for your work?" His words struck at the heart of truths Eleanor had been avoiding for 3 years. She had been existing rather than living, going through the motions of daily life while her heart remained frozen in the moment of Thomas's death. The candle in the window had become both a memorial and a prison, a ritual that kept her tethered to the past while preventing her from moving forward into whatever future might await. "You speak with great wisdom for a soldier," Eleanor said, attempting to lighten the heavy emotion that pressed down upon her chest. "I would have expected more bluntness and less philosophy." Rowan smiled, and the expression transformed his stern features into something almost boyish. "I have had years to contemplate such matters, Mistress Whitmore. When you have seen as much death as I have, witnessed as much suffering and loss, you learn to recognize when someone is trapped by their own grief. I see in you what I once saw in my own reflection, a person so focused on what they have lost that they cannot see what they might yet gain." Before Eleanor could respond, a knock at the door interrupted their conversation. A young servant girl entered, carrying a tray laden with food and a pitcher of wine. She set it on the table near the window, curtsied to both Eleanor and Rowan, and departed without speaking. The smell of fresh bread, roasted meat, and cheese made Eleanor realize she had not eaten since the previous afternoon, and her stomach responded with an audible growl that made Rowan chuckle. "Eat and rest," he instructed, rising to his feet with the fluid grace that characterized all his movements. "I will return this evening to check on you and to discuss what supplies you will need for your work here. If you require anything before then, simply inform one of the servants, and they will see to it. You are under Lord Ashford's protection now, which means you have the authority to command resources as you see fit." After Rowan departed, Eleanor forced herself to eat, though the rich food sat heavily in her stomach, unaccustomed as she was to such fare. She managed several bites of bread and cheese, drank a cup of wine that warmed her from the inside, and then found herself drawn to the bed, its comfortable appearance irresistible to her exhausted body. She removed only her boots and outer cloak before climbing beneath the covers, intending to rest for just a few minutes. Instead, she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep that lasted well into the afternoon. When Eleanor finally woke, sunlight was slanting through the window at a sharp angle, indicating that several hours had passed. She lay still for a moment, disoriented by her unfamiliar surroundings, before memory returned and with it the full weight of her changed circumstances. Rising from the bed, she crossed to the window and looked out over the castle grounds, watching servants and soldiers go about their duties, a whole world of activity that she was now part of, whether she had chosen it or not. Her thoughts turned to Catherine, wondering how the girl was faring, and Eleanor decided that checking on her patient would be a good way to begin establishing her new role. She tidied her appearance as best she could without fresh clothing or a proper mirror, splashed water from a basin onto her face, and made her way back through the castle corridors to Catherine's chamber. The guards at the door recognized her and stepped aside without question, a small sign of the authority Lord Ashford had granted her. Inside the chamber, she found Catherine awake and sitting propped against pillows, looking pale and weak, but undeniably improved from the previous night's crisis. Margaret sat beside the bed, spooning broth into the girl's mouth with patient care, while Lord Ashford occupied a chair near the window, reviewing documents that a steward had brought him. He looked up as Eleanor entered, and something in his stern features softened slightly. "Mistress Whitmore," he acknowledged with a nod. "I trust you found your chambers satisfactory." "More than satisfactory, my lord," Eleanor replied, approaching Catherine's bedside. "They are far grander than anything I am accustomed to. I hope to prove worthy of such generosity through my service." "See that you do," Lord Ashford said, though his tone lacked the harshness it might have carried. He set aside his documents and stood. "I will leave Catherine in your capable hands. I have matters requiring my attention, but send word immediately if there is any change in her condition." After the lord departed, Eleanor conducted a thorough examination of Catherine, checking her temperature, listening to her breathing, and asking questions about her symptoms. The girl's responses were weak but coherent, and Eleanor was pleased to see that the treatment was continuing to work. She prepared fresh poultices and another dose of fever tea, working with the easy competence born of years of practice. "Thank you," Catherine whispered as Eleanor adjusted the blankets around her. "Margaret told me what you did, how you stayed awake all night treating me. I owe you my life." "You owe me nothing," Eleanor said gently. "I did what any healer would do. Now you must focus on recovering your strength. The illness has taken much from you, and it will be some time before you feel yourself again." Catherine's blue eyes, so like her father's, studied Eleanor with surprising intensity for someone so recently at death's door. "Margaret also told me that Lord Ashford has made you the castle herbalist, that you will be staying here permanently. I am glad of it. We have needed someone with true knowledge of healing, not just the physician with his leeches and bloodletting." Eleanor smiled at the girl's spirit, seeing in her a strength of character that had no doubt helped her survive both the illness and the complicated circumstances of her birth. "I confess I am still adjusting to the idea myself. Yesterday I was a simple village herbalist, and today I find myself part of a noble household. The change is rather overwhelming." "Changes often are," Catherine said quietly, "but they can also bring unexpected blessings. I have lived my entire life in this castle, neither servant nor noble, belonging fully to neither world. It has taught me that sometimes the best things come from circumstances we did not choose but learned to embrace." The wisdom in those words, coming from one so young, struck Eleanor deeply. She spent the next hour tending to Catherine, changing poultices and encouraging her to take more broth, all while engaging in conversation that revealed the girl to be both intelligent and thoughtful, with a keen understanding of human nature that belied her years and sheltered existence. As evening approached, Rowan arrived as promised, appearing in the doorway of Catherine's chamber with his customary quiet confidence. Eleanor felt her heart give an unexpected flutter at the sight of him, a reaction that both surprised and unsettled her. She had not felt such a response to any man since Thomas's death, had believed herself incapable of such feelings, and the sudden resurgence of attraction left her confused and slightly guilty, as if acknowledging interest in another man somehow betrayed her late husband's memory. "How is our patient?" Rowan asked, though his eyes were on Eleanor rather than Catherine. "Improving steadily," Eleanor reported, forcing her voice to remain professional despite the warmth spreading through her chest. "The fever remains manageable, and she is keeping down both liquids and light food. If this progress continues, I believe she will be out of danger within a few days." "Excellent news," Rowan said, finally turning his attention to Catherine and offering her a warm smile. "You gave us all quite a fright, young lady. Try not to make a habit of such dramatics." Catherine managed a weak laugh. "I shall do my best, Sir Rowan, though I confess I remember very little of what happened. It is all rather a blur of pain and confusion." "Perhaps that is a mercy," Rowan said gently. Then to Eleanor, "When you have finished here, I would like to discuss your needs for establishing your workroom. I have had servants begin clearing the space adjacent to your chambers, and we should determine what equipment and supplies you require." Eleanor nodded, finishing her ministrations to Catherine and gathering her satchel. She bid the girl good night, extracting a promise that she would rest and not try to do too much too soon, then followed Rowan out into the corridor. They walked in comfortable silence for a time, the only sounds the echo of their footsteps on stone and the distant noises of castle life filtering through walls and doorways. "You seem troubled," Rowan observed as they climbed the stairs toward Eleanor's chambers. "Is it merely the strangeness of your new situation, or is there something more specific weighing on your mind?" Eleanor hesitated, unsure how much to reveal to this man who was still essentially a stranger, despite the unexpected intimacy that seemed to have developed between them. But something in his steady presence invited confidence, and she found herself speaking truths she had barely admitted to herself. "I feel as though I am betraying Thomas," she confessed quietly. "By accepting this new life, by allowing myself to feel something other than grief, I worry that I am dishonoring his memory, forgetting him too easily." Rowan stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious and intent. "May I tell you something I learned in the years after Isabel's death? Something that took me far too long to understand." Eleanor nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. "The dead do not want us to suffer endlessly in their name," Rowan said, his voice low and earnest. "They do not wish for us to build monuments of grief and live our remaining days as hollow ghosts of who we once were. Those we love want us to live, truly live, to find joy and purpose, and perhaps even love again. To do otherwise is not to honor their memory, but to waste the life they would want us to embrace. Your Thomas, if he loved you as deeply as I suspect he did, would not want you sitting alone in a cottage, lighting candles for ghosts. He would want you here, using your gifts, helping others, and opening your heart to whatever possibilities the future might hold." Tears gathered in Eleanor's eyes, and she blinked them back, struggling to maintain her composure. "How can you be so certain of what he would want?" "Because it is what I would want if our positions were reversed," Rowan said simply. "If I had died and Isabel had lived, I would want her to find happiness again, to love again if such fortune came her way. Anything less would be a terrible waste of a precious life." They stood in the corridor, the space between them charged with an emotion Eleanor could not name but felt in every fiber of her being. Rowan reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and gently wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb, the gesture tender and careful, as if she were something fragile that might shatter at rough handling. The touch of Rowan's hand against her cheek sent a tremor through Eleanor that had nothing to do with cold or fear, and everything to do with the sudden, overwhelming awareness of how long it had been since anyone had touched her with such gentleness, such care. For 3 years she had lived in a world of her own making, walls built of grief and solitude, keeping everyone at a distance while she nursed her sorrow like a sacred flame. Now those walls felt as though they were crumbling, and the sensation was both terrifying and strangely liberating, like stepping from a dark room into brilliant sunlight after years of shadow. Rowan seemed to sense the tumult of emotions coursing through her, and he withdrew his hand slowly, though his gray eyes remained fixed on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Forgive me if I have overstepped," he said quietly. "I do not mean to cause you distress or to presume feelings that may not exist. I only wish you to know that you need not carry your burdens alone, that there are those who would gladly share the weight if you would allow it." Eleanor found her voice, though it emerged softer than she intended. "You have not overstepped, Sir Rowan. Indeed, I find your words bring me more comfort than distress, though I confess I am not entirely certain what to do with such comfort. I have grown so accustomed to grief as my constant companion that I scarcely know how to exist without it." "Then perhaps it is time to learn," Rowan suggested, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "And I would be honored to assist in that education if you would permit it. But come, let us attend to more practical matters for now. Your workroom awaits, and I suspect that focusing on tangible tasks will help ease your troubled thoughts." They continued to Eleanor's chambers, and Rowan led her to the adjacent room he had mentioned earlier, a space that had been thoroughly cleaned and prepared for her use. The room was smaller than her sleeping chamber, but still generously proportioned, with a large table dominating the center, shelves lining the walls, and a separate fireplace that could be used for heating preparations that required precise temperature control. Several wooden crates sat in one corner, and when Eleanor investigated, she found them filled with glass bottles, ceramic jars, measuring instruments, and various tools she would need for her work. Lord Ashford ordered these brought from the castle stores and from merchants in the nearest town, Rowan explained, watching as Eleanor examined the supplies with evident pleasure. If there is anything missing or additional items you require, you need only make a list, and they will be procured. Eleanor ran her fingers over the smooth glass of the bottles, the cool ceramic of the jars, feeling a spark of genuine excitement kindle in her chest. With resources like these, she could prepare medicines far more sophisticated than anything she had been able to create in her modest cottage. She could experiment with combinations and preparations she had only read about in her mother's ancient texts, could help people in ways that had previously been beyond her capability. "This is extraordinary," she breathed, already envisioning how she would organize the space where each herb would be stored, how she would arrange her tools for maximum efficiency. "I have never had access to such quality equipment. The possibilities are almost overwhelming." Rowan leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed over his broad chest, watching her with an expression of quiet satisfaction. "It pleases me to see you smile, Eleanor. You should do it more often. It transforms your entire countenance, makes you even more beautiful than you already are." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks at the compliment, and she ducked her head, suddenly feeling like a young girl receiving her first words of admiration from a suitor. "You should not say such things, Sir Rowan. It is not proper for a knight to speak so familiarly to a common herbalist." "Perhaps not," Rowan conceded, pushing away from the doorframe and moving closer, his presence filling the space in a way that made Eleanor acutely aware of him. "But I have never been particularly concerned with what is proper when it conflicts with what is true. You are beautiful, Eleanor Whitmore, and I will not pretend otherwise simply to observe social conventions that mean little to me." Eleanor looked up at him, her heart pounding in her chest like a drum, beating out a rhythm of both anxiety and anticipation. She had not felt this alive, this present in her own skin, since before Thomas's death, and the sensation was almost painful in its intensity. "Why?" she asked, the question emerging before she could think better of it. "Why do you look at me as you do? Why do you speak to me with such warmth? You barely know me, and I am nothing special, just a village woman who knows something of herbs and healing." Rowan's expression grew serious, and he took another step closer, close enough now that Eleanor could see the faint scar above his left eyebrow, the precise shade of gray in his eyes, the strong line of his jaw. "I look at you as I do because from the moment I met you, standing in your cottage doorway with your candle burning in the window, I saw someone extraordinary. I saw a woman of courage and compassion who had suffered terrible loss, yet still chose to help others, who maintained hope in the face of hopelessness, who possessed both strength and gentleness in equal measure, and I knew in that instant that meeting you was going to change my life in ways I could not yet comprehend." Eleanor's breath caught, and she found herself unable to look away from his gaze, trapped in the intensity of the moment. "Sir Rowan, just Rowan," he interrupted gently. "Please, when we are alone like this, let there be no titles between us, no barriers of rank or station. Let us simply be two people who have found something unexpected in each other's company." "Rowan," Eleanor repeated, tasting his name on her tongue, finding she liked the way it felt. "I must confess that I am frightened, not of you, but of what I feel when I am near you, of how quickly my heart seems to be forgetting its loyalty to the past in favor of something new and uncertain." Rowan reached out and took her hands in his grip warm and steady and infinitely reassuring. "There is no disloyalty in allowing yourself to live again, Eleanor. Your heart has room for both the love you bore your husband and whatever feelings might be growing for someone new. One does not diminish the other. Love is not a finite resource that must be rationed and guarded, but rather something that grows and expands to encompass all that we allow into our lives." Before Eleanor could respond, a sharp knock at the door interrupted the moment, and they stepped apart quickly, though Rowan kept hold of one of her hands for a moment longer before releasing it. A servant appeared in the doorway, a young man who bowed respectfully before delivering his message. "Sir Rowan, Lord Ashford requests your presence in the Great Hall. There are visitors from the south, representatives of King Edward's court, and the Lord wishes you present for the discussions." Rowan's expression shifted instantly from the gentle warmth he had shown Eleanor to the alert professionalism of a soldier receiving orders. "Tell Lord Ashford I will be there momentarily," he instructed, and the servant departed with another bow. Turning back to Eleanor, Rowan's face softened again, though she could see the tension that had entered his frame, the readiness for whatever duty might require. I must go, but we will continue this conversation, I hope. Tomorrow, if you are willing, I would like to show you more of the castle and its grounds. There is much you should know about your new home, and I confess I would welcome the excuse to spend more time in your company. Eleanor found herself nodding before her rational mind could raise objections. I would like that. And Rowan, thank you for everything you have said tonight, for understanding what I could barely articulate to myself. It means more than you might realize. He smiled, and the expression transformed his stern warrior's face into something warm and approachable. Until tomorrow then, Eleanor. He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that sent warmth radiating up her arm, and then he was gone, his footsteps echoing down the corridor with the purposeful stride of a man attending to his duties. Eleanor stood alone in her new workroom, her hand tingling where his lips had touched it, her heart racing with a complicated mixture of emotions she could not entirely sort through. She felt guilty for the attraction she could no longer deny, anxious about what it might mean, excited by possibilities she had thought forever closed to her, and beneath it all, a small tentative hope that perhaps her life was not over after all, that perhaps there were still chapters yet to be written in a story she had believed finished. The following days established a new rhythm to Eleanor's existence. Her mornings were spent tending to Catherine, whose recovery progressed steadily thanks to Eleanor's diligent care and the girl's own resilient constitution. They talked during these sessions, and Eleanor discovered in Catherine a kindred spirit, someone who understood the complexity of living between worlds, of not quite belonging anywhere yet finding ways to create meaning and purpose, despite uncertain circumstances. Tell me about your life before the castle, Catherine asked one morning, as Eleanor changed the poultices on her forehead. What was it like in Wintermere Village? Eleanor considered the question, finding it strange to think of her former life as something distant enough to be described as before, as if it had already receded into the realm of memory rather than remaining her present reality. It was quiet, she said finally, peaceful in its way, though also lonely. I knew everyone in the village, had treated most of them at one time or another, but I always felt somewhat apart, separate, perhaps because my knowledge set me aside, or perhaps because I had built walls around myself after Thomas died, and never let anyone truly close. You speak of him in the past tense now, Catherine observed gently. When you first arrived, you could barely mention him without your voice breaking. Something has changed. Eleanor paused in her work, recognizing the truth in Catherine's words. Yes, she admitted softly. Something has changed. Or perhaps I have changed. I am beginning to understand that holding on to grief so tightly does not honor the dead, but imprisons the living. Thomas would not have wanted me to spend my life as a ghost, haunting my own existence. Catherine smiled, a knowing expression that made her look older than her years. Sir Rowan has been good for you, I think. I have seen how he looks at you when he thinks no one is watching, and I have seen how you blush when he enters a room. It is good to see life returning to someone who had forgotten how to embrace it. Is it that obvious? Eleanor asked, mortified at the thought that their growing connection was apparent to others. Only to those who know what to look for, Catherine assured her. And only because I am confined to this bed with little to do but observe the people who come and go. Do not worry, your secret is safe with me, though I confess I do not understand why it needs to be a secret at all. Sir Rowan is a good man, honorable and kind beneath his warrior's exterior, and you are a woman of worth and beauty. Why should you not seek happiness together? Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, her hands falling idle in her lap. Because it feels too soon, too fast. Thomas has been dead only 3 years. What will people think if I move on so quickly? Will they judge me harshly? Call me faithless or fickle? People will always judge, Catherine said wisely. It is what people do, particularly when they have little else to occupy their minds. But their judgments need not govern your choices, Eleanor. You have already spent 3 years in mourning, 3 years denying yourself any possibility of joy or companionship. How many more years must you sacrifice to satisfy the opinions of people who will criticize you regardless of what you do? The girl's words echoed thoughts Eleanor had been having with increasing frequency, and she recognized the truth in them even as part of her resisted the implications. Change was frightening, particularly when it meant letting go of familiar pain in favor of uncertain possibilities. Yet she could not deny that the days since arriving at Castle Greystone had awakened something within her that she had believed dead, a capacity for feeling and hoping and wanting that grief had suppressed but not entirely extinguished. Her afternoons were spent organizing her workroom, a task that brought her deep satisfaction as she arranged her supplies with meticulous care, creating systems of organization that would allow her to work with maximum efficiency. She labeled each jar and bottle with careful script, noting not only the contents but also the date of harvest and any special properties or cautions associated with each herb. The shelves gradually filled with her collection, arranged by category and then alphabetically within each group, a system her mother had taught her that made finding specific remedies quick and intuitive, even in moments of crisis. Eleanor found herself humming as she worked, a tuneless melody that surprised her when she became conscious of it, realizing it had been years since she had felt light-hearted enough to make such unconscious expressions of contentment. True to his word, Rowan came to see her each day, sometimes bringing requests from Lord Ashford for specific medicines or treatments, other times simply appearing with no official purpose beyond the apparent desire for her company. He showed her the castle's extensive grounds, walking with her through gardens that would be magnificent in spring, but now lay dormant under the approaching winter, explaining the history of various buildings and introducing her to key members of the household staff. These walks became the highlight of Eleanor's days, moments she found herself anticipating with an eagerness that would have alarmed her had she allowed herself to examine it too closely. On the 5th day after her arrival at Castle Greystone, as Eleanor and Rowan walked along the battlements overlooking the countryside spread below like a patchwork quilt of fields and forests, he spoke of matters that clearly weighed on his mind. The representatives from King Edward's court had departed the previous day, and their visit had evidently brought news that troubled the castle's inhabitants. "There is talk of war," Rowan said, his hands resting on the cold stone of the wall, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon where gray clouds gathered. "The king's ambitions in France grow ever more aggressive, and Lord Ashford has been commanded to provide men and resources for the coming campaign. I will likely be called upon to lead a contingent of soldiers south within the month." Eleanor felt her stomach clench at his words, a cold fear spreading through her chest that she had no right to feel. What was Rowan to her, after all, beyond a man she had known for less than a week? Yet the thought of him riding off to war, of facing the countless dangers that awaited soldiers in foreign lands, filled her with a dread that could not be rationalized away. "How long would you be gone?" she asked, keeping her voice carefully neutral despite the emotion churning beneath the surface. "Months, perhaps a year or more," Rowan replied. "Wars are unpredictable things, Eleanor. They begin with grand plans and clear objectives, but once the fighting starts, nothing unfolds as anticipated. Men die, strategies fail, and what was meant to be a swift campaign becomes a prolonged nightmare of siege and skirmish." Eleanor moved closer to him, drawn by an impulse she did not fully understand, until she stood at his side, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body, despite the cold wind that whipped around them. "You have seen much war already," she observed quietly. "Does it not weary you, the constant fighting, the endless cycle of violence and death?" Rowan turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw shadows of things witnessed and endured, horrors that had left marks on his soul even if his body bore few visible scars. "It wearies me beyond measure," he admitted. "Each battle takes something from me, some small piece of my humanity that I fear I will never recover. I have killed men whose names I never learned, whose families will never know what became of them. I have watched friends die in agony, held their hands as life left their bodies, and carried the weight of survivors' guilt for years afterward. War is a terrible thing, Eleanor. Necessary perhaps in some circumstances, but terrible nonetheless." "Then why go?" Eleanor asked, though she knew the answer even before he spoke it. "Why not refuse? Find some way to avoid this summons." "Because I am sworn to Lord Ashford, and through him to the king," Rowan said simply. "My honor demands that I fulfill my obligations, regardless of personal cost. To refuse would be to break my oath, to become forsworn, and I would rather die than live as a man without integrity. It is all I have left, Eleanor, the one thing that defines who I am beneath the armor and the title." Eleanor understood the sentiment, recognized in it the same sense of duty and commitment to principle that had driven her own decisions throughout her life. Yet understanding did not make acceptance any easier. did not ease the tight knot of fear and loss that had formed in her chest at the thought of Rowan leaving, perhaps never to return. When Isabel died, Rowan continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, I believe my capacity for caring about anyone had died with her. For 5 years I have lived as a soldier and nothing more, existing from one battle to the next without forming any attachments or allowing myself to hope for anything beyond survival. But then I met you, standing in your cottage doorway with grief written in every line of your face, yet still willing to help a stranger in need, and something shifted within me. For the first time since losing Isabel, I found myself wanting something more than just the next day's breath. Eleanor turned to face him fully, her heart pounding so hard she was certain he must hear it. Rowan, what are you saying? He reached out and took her hands in his grip warm and steady despite the cold wind that tugged at their clothing and whipped Eleanor's hair across her face. I am saying that I have fallen in love with you, Eleanor Whitmore, quickly and completely, in a way I did not think possible after so many years of keeping my heart locked away. I know it is madness, that we have known each other barely a week, that you are still healing from your own loss, and I have no right to burden you with such declarations. But with war looming and the possibility that I might not return, I find I cannot keep silent. I needed you to know, needed to speak the truth aloud at least once, even if you cannot return the sentiment. Eleanor stared at him, her mind reeling from the intensity of his confession, her heart soaring and breaking simultaneously at the impossible beauty and timing of it all. She had spent 3 years convinced she would never feel anything for another man, that her capacity for love had been buried with Thomas in the churchyard at Windermere. Yet here stood Rowan, strong and gentle and utterly sincere, offering her a gift she had believed forever beyond her reach. I do not know what to say, Eleanor whispered, tears gathering in her eyes. I am terrified, Rowan, terrified of what I feel for you, terrified of losing you before I have even had the chance to explore where these feelings might lead, terrified of dishonoring Thomas's memory by allowing my heart to open to another. Rowan released one of her hands and cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing away the tears that had begun to fall. Then say nothing, he murmured. Do not speak out of obligation or fear or uncertainty. When you are ready, if you are ever ready, I will be here to listen. But know this, Eleanor, loving again does not dishonor the dead. It honors them by proving that the love they gave us did not die with them, but instead taught us how to love again, how to open our hearts despite the risk of loss, how to be brave enough to embrace life in all its painful beauty. Before Eleanor could respond, before conscious thought could intervene and counsel caution, she rose onto her toes and pressed her lips to his, a kiss that was equal parts desperation and hope, grief and joy, ending and beginning. Rowan responded immediately, his arms coming around her and pulling her close, his mouth moving against hers with a tenderness that made her chest ache with its sweetness. They stood together on the battlements, the wind howling around them and the world falling away, until nothing existed except the warmth of their embrace and the rightness of two wounded souls finding solace in each other's arms. When they finally drew apart, both breathing hard, Eleanor rested her forehead against Rowan's chest, listening to the rapid beating of his heart that matched her own. I cannot promise you anything, she said quietly. I cannot say the words you spoke to me, not yet, though I feel something powerful growing between us that I can no longer deny. But I can promise you this. When you leave for war, you will not go as a man alone and unconnected. You will go knowing that someone waits for you here, someone who will light a candle in the window each night and pray for your safe return, someone who will hold hope for both of us when the darkness seems too great to bear. Rowan pressed a kiss to the top of her head, his arms tightening around her. That is more than I dared hope for, Eleanor. It is everything and more than enough. They stood together for a long time, watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, neither speaking, but both drawing strength and comfort from the other's presence. Eleanor felt something shift inside her, a door opening that she had kept locked and barred for 3 long years, and while the prospect of what lay beyond that door still frightened her, she was beginning to believe that perhaps fear did not have to rule her choices, that perhaps courage meant moving forward despite uncertainty, rather than waiting for guarantees that would never come. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity and emotion. Catherine recovered fully, regaining her strength and color, until she was able to leave her bed and move about the castle, though Eleanor insisted she take things slowly and not overtax herself too quickly. Lord Ashford's relief and gratitude were evident in his increasingly generous treatment of Eleanor, granting her additional resources and authority that elevated her position within the household to something approaching that of a noble's personal physician. Eleanor established herself firmly in her role as castle herbalist, treating everything from minor injuries among the guards to a nasty outbreak of winter fever among the younger servants. Her workroom became a place of constant activity, with people coming and going at all hours, seeking remedies and advice. She discovered a talent for teaching, taking time to instruct Margaret and several other interested servants in basic herbalism, sharing knowledge that her mother had passed to her with the understanding that wisdom hoarded was wisdom wasted. Through it all, her relationship with Rowan deepened in ways both spoken and unspoken. They met whenever his duties allowed, stealing moments together in gardens and corridors, on battlements and in quiet corners of the castle where they could talk without interruption. Rowan told her stories of his travels, of places he had seen and battles he had fought, while Eleanor shared memories of her mother and childhood, of Thomas and the life they had built together before tragedy tore it apart. She found that speaking of Thomas no longer brought the sharp, cutting pain it once had, but rather a gentle sadness mixed with gratitude for the years they had shared. One evening, as Eleanor worked in her chamber preparing a batch of sleeping draughts for soldiers plagued by nightmares, Rowan appeared at her door with news that made her heart sink. "The orders have come," he said without preamble, his face grave. "We leave in 3 days' time. Lord Ashford has committed 200 men to the King's campaign, and I am to command them. We ride south to join the main army assembling near Dover, and from there we will cross to France." Eleanor set down the vial she had been holding, her hands suddenly unsteady. She had known this moment was coming, had tried to prepare herself emotionally for the reality of Rowan's departure, but now that it was upon her, she found all her careful mental preparations inadequate to the task of maintaining composure. 3 days, she repeated, her voice hollow. So soon. Rowan crossed the room and pulled her into his arms, holding her close as if he could somehow protect her from the pain of separation through physical proximity alone. "I wish I had more time, Eleanor. I wish I did not have to go at all. But the choice is not mine to make." Eleanor clung to him, breathing in the scent of leather and steel and something uniquely him that she had come to associate with safety and warmth. "Promise me you will be careful," she whispered against his chest. "Promise me you will do whatever necessary to survive and return to me." "I promise," Rowan said, though they both knew it was a promise he might not have the power to keep. War cared nothing for promises or prayers, taking whom it would without regard for love or loss or the desperate hopes of those left behind. The 3 days before Rowan's departure passed with agonizing swiftness, each hour slipping away like water through cupped hands, despite Eleanor's desperate wish to slow time's relentless march. She threw herself into preparing medicines and supplies for the soldiers who would accompany Rowan to war, creating salves for wounds, powders to prevent infection, and tinctures for pain that she packed carefully into leather satchels designed to survive the rigors of campaign. It gave her something constructive to focus on, a way to feel that she was contributing to Rowan's safety even if she could not accompany him into battle. Lord Ashford summoned her to his private chambers on the evening before the army's departure, a meeting that surprised Eleanor as she had expected no further interaction with the stern nobleman beyond their professional relationship. She found him standing by the window of his study, a room lined with shelves of books and documents, maps spread across a heavy oak desk that dominated the center of the space. "Mistress Whitmore," he greeted her with a nod, gesturing for her to enter and close the door behind her. "Thank you for coming. I know you have been busy with preparations for tomorrow's departure." "It is no trouble, my lord," Eleanor replied, curious about the purpose of this private audience. "How may I be of service?" Lord Ashford studied her with those cold blue eyes that seemed to see far more than most people's, and Eleanor had the distinct impression of being weighed and measured against some internal standard only he knew. "I am not a man blind to what occurs within my own household," he said finally. "I have observed the growing connection between you and Sir Rowan, and while I generally do not involve myself in the personal affairs of those who serve me, I felt compelled to speak with you before he departs." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks, embarrassed that their relationship had been so transparent. But she met Lord Ashford's gaze steadily, refusing to show shame for feelings she had come to accept as natural and right. Sir Rowan and I have indeed formed an attachment, my lord. I hope this does not displease you or reflect poorly on either of us. Displease me? Lord Ashford's expression softened slightly, the harsh lines of his face easing into something almost resembling approval. On the contrary, Mistress Whitmore, Rowan Steele is the finest man I have ever had the privilege to command, honorable to a fault and utterly dedicated to his duties. For 5 years I have watched him exist in a state of carefully controlled emptiness, going through the motions of living without truly embracing life. You have accomplished what I thought impossible, bringing him back from that dark place and giving him something to fight for beyond mere duty. Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, moved by the unexpected support from a man she had believed incapable of such sentiment. He has given me something as well, my lord. He has helped me understand that grief need not be a prison, that it is possible to honor the past while still opening oneself to the future. Lord Ashford nodded slowly, then crossed to his desk and removed a small leather pouch from a drawer, which he handed to Eleanor. When she opened it, she found it filled with gold coins, more money than she had seen in her entire life. This is for you, Lord Ashford said before she could protest. Not payment for your services, which are already generously compensated, but rather a gift given in recognition of what you have done for Catherine and for the effect you have had on Sir Rowan. Should the worst occur and he does not return from France, you will have the means to live comfortably regardless of whether you choose to remain at Castle Greystone or return to your village. Eleanor clutched the pouch, overwhelmed by the nobleman's generosity and the terrible pragmatism underlying it. The money represented security, independence, the freedom to choose her own path without being beholden to anyone. It also represented Lord Ashford's acknowledgement that Rowan might not survive the war, a possibility Eleanor had been trying desperately not to contemplate. "Thank you, my lord," she managed, her voice thick with emotion. "Your kindness is far greater than I deserve. I pray that I will never need to rely on this gift, that Sir Rowan will return safely, and we will all be reunited here in health and happiness." "As do I, Mistress Whitmore," Lord Ashford said quietly. "As do I. Now go. Spend what time remains with him. Tomorrow will bring sorrows enough without wasting tonight in formal meetings." Eleanor left Lord Ashford's study and went in search of Rowan, finding him in the armory overseeing final preparations for the journey. He stood among racks of weapons and armor, discussing logistics with several other officers, his voice calm and authoritative as he issued instructions and answered questions. When he saw Eleanor, he excused himself from the group and crossed to her, concern evident in his expression. "What is wrong?" he asked, noting the tears that still glistened in her eyes. "Has something happened?" Eleanor shook her head, managing a watery smile. "Nothing is wrong. Lord Ashford summoned me to his study. He knows about us, Rowan, and he approves. More than that, he gave me a gift, money enough to ensure my security, regardless of what the future holds." Rowan's expression shifted through several emotions, surprise, gratitude, and something that looked like relief. "He is a better man than his reputation suggests," he said softly. "Hard and demanding, yes, but also fair and surprisingly compassionate when it comes to those he values. I am glad he spoke with you. Glad you know that our relationship has his blessing." They stood together in the armory, surrounded by the implements of war, and Eleanor felt the weight of the coming separation pressing down upon her like a physical force. "Will you come to my chambers tonight?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I do not wish to spend what may be our last evening together surrounded by steel and strangers. I want to talk with you, to be near you, to create memories that will sustain me through however many months of waiting lie ahead." Rowan's eyes darkened with emotion, and he nodded. "I will come as soon as I can break away from my duties. Wait for me, Eleanor. I will not be long." Eleanor returned to her chambers and prepared them with care, lighting candles that cast warm, flickering light across the room, building up the fire until it crackled merrily in the hearth, and setting out wine and bread in case Rowan had not eaten. She changed into her finest dress, a gown of deep blue wool that Lord Ashford had given her as part of her new wardrobe, and brushed her hair until it shone in the candlelight, falling in waves down her back. It had been years since she had taken such care with her appearance, and she was surprised by how much it mattered to her that Rowan see her at her best. When he arrived near midnight, He had changed from his armor into simple but well-made clothing, a tunic of dark gray wool over black leggings, his sword belt removed and his hair still damp from recent washing. He stood in her doorway, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, drinking in details as if trying to memorize every feature, every expression, every small thing that made the other unique and precious. "You are beautiful," Rowan said, breaking the silence. "So beautiful that it makes my chest ache to look at you, knowing that tomorrow I must ride away and leave you behind." Eleanor crossed to him and took his hands, drawing him into the room and closing the door behind him. "Then let us not think of tomorrow tonight," she said softly. "Let us pretend, just for these few hours, that we have all the time in the world, that no war waits to tear us apart, that we are simply two people who have found something rare and precious in each other." They sat together by the fire, sharing wine and conversation that ranged from profound to playful, from serious discussions of faith and purpose to light-hearted exchanges of childhood memories and favorite stories. Rowan told her about growing up as the youngest son of a minor noble family, how he had been sent to train as a knight at 12 years old, leaving behind everything familiar to learn the arts of war and chivalry. Eleanor spoke of her mother's teachings, of the garden they had tended together where every plant had a purpose and a story, of the pride she had felt the first time she successfully treated a serious illness without her mother's guidance. As the night deepened and the candles burned lower, their conversation grew more intimate, touching on fears and hopes, on the dreams they harbored and the regrets they carried. Rowan confessed that he worried he had become too hardened by war, that years of violence had eroded something essential in his character that he might never recover. Eleanor admitted that she feared being left alone again, that losing Rowan after only just finding him would break something in her that even time could not heal. "If I do not return," Rowan said at one point, his voice heavy with emotion, "I want you to know that these weeks with you have been the happiest of my life since losing Isabel. You have given me a gift beyond price, Eleanor. You have reminded me what it feels like to hope, to dream of a future beyond the next battle, to imagine a life filled with something other than duty and obligation." Eleanor placed her hand over his heart, feeling it beat strong and steady beneath her palm. "You will return," she said with fierce conviction. "I refuse to accept any other outcome. You will survive this war and come back to me, and we will have the chance to build the life we have only begun to imagine. I will not entertain thoughts of loss, Rowan. I spent 3 years drowning in grief, and I will not go back to that dark place willingly." Rowan covered her hand with his own, his eyes burning with intensity. "Then I make you a solemn vow, Eleanor Whitmore. I will do everything in my power to return to you. I will fight with the strength of 10 men. I will be cautious when caution is wise and bold when boldness is required, and I will never forget that someone waits for me here, someone worth surviving for, worth coming home to." They sealed the vow with a kiss that spoke of promise and passion, of commitment and desperate hope. Eleanor lost herself in the embrace, in the warmth of Rowan's arms and the taste of his lips, in the feeling of being cherished and desired in ways she had forgotten were possible. They held each other through the night, sometimes talking, sometimes simply existing together in comfortable silence, creating a sanctuary of intimacy and connection that would have to sustain them through the long separation ahead. As dawn approached, painting the sky outside Eleanor's window in shades of pink and gold, they rose together and prepared for the day that would tear them apart. Rowan dressed slowly, each piece of clothing and armor a step closer to his departure, while Eleanor watched with a heart that felt too large for her chest, swollen with love and fear in equal measure. "I have something for you," Eleanor said, as Rowan buckled on his sword belt, and she crossed to her workroom, returning with a small leather pouch tied with a ribbon. "It is a charm, not magical in any supernatural sense, but made with herbs that are said to bring protection and good fortune. Foxglove for strength, rosemary for remembrance, lavender for devotion. Wear it close to your heart, and know that wherever you go, my thoughts and prayers go with you." Rowan accepted the charm with hands that trembled slightly, tucking it carefully inside his tunic where it would rest against his skin. "I will treasure this as I treasure you, Eleanor. It will be my talisman, my reminder of what waits for me here." They descended to the courtyard together as the castle came alive with activity, soldiers assembling in ranks, horses being saddled, supply wagons loaded with provisions and equipment. Lord Ashford stood on the steps leading to the main hall, Catherine at his side, both dressed formally for the occasion of seeing the army off to war. Eleanor noted how Catherine watched the proceedings with a mixture of pride and sorrow, understanding that the girl had her own complicated feelings about her father's soldiers riding off to potential death. Rowan took his place at the head of his men, mounted on his great black stallion, and for a moment Eleanor saw him as others must see him, a warrior lord in gleaming armor, fierce and capable and utterly commanding. But then his eyes found hers across the crowded courtyard, and the stern warrior's mask slipped, revealing the man beneath, the one who had held her through the night and whispered words of love against her hair. Lord Ashford gave a speech, words of duty and honor and service to king and country, that Eleanor barely heard over the pounding of her own heart. Then, with a great shout and the thundering of hooves, the army began to move, flowing through the gates like a river of steel and horseflesh, banners snapping in the morning breeze and armor glinting in the early sunlight. Eleanor stood watching until the last soldier had passed from view, until the sound of hoofbeats had faded into the distance, until nothing remained but dust settling slowly back to earth. Catherine came to stand beside her, slipping a hand into Eleanor's and squeezing gently. "He will return," the girl said softly, echoing Eleanor's own desperate hope. "Sir Rowan is too strong, too skilled, too determined to fall in some foreign field. He will survive because he has something worth surviving for." Eleanor nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She thought of the candle she used to light in her cottage window, the nightly ritual of hope for an impossible return. Now she would light a new candle, not for the dead but for the living, not for what was lost but for what might yet be found. She would wait, as she had learned to wait, but this time her waiting would be active rather than passive, filled with purpose and preparation rather than empty grief. The months that followed were both longer and shorter than Eleanor could have imagined. Days blended into weeks, weeks into months, as autumn surrendered fully to winter and then slowly, grudgingly, began its transformation into spring. News from France came sporadically, carried by messengers and returning wounded, fragments of information that Eleanor pieced together like a puzzle, whose final image remained frustratingly unclear. She learned of battles won and lost, of sieges endured and towns captured, of casualties mounting on both sides as the war ground on with no clear end in sight. Eleanor threw herself into her work with renewed dedication, treating the steady stream of ailments and injuries that afflicted the castle's inhabitants, expanding her knowledge through study of the medical texts in Lord Ashford's library, and training several promising students in the healing arts. Catherine became not just a patient but a true friend, the two women spending long evenings together, talking and working on various projects, their bond strengthened by shared experiences of living in the liminal spaces between worlds. Each evening, without fail, Eleanor lit a candle in her window, a beacon of hope visible from the courtyard below. It became a ritual that others in the castle came to recognize and respect, servants and soldiers alike taking comfort in the steady flame that symbolized faith in the absent, hope for the future, and the enduring power of love to transcend distance and danger. Lord Ashford, too, changed during those months, his stern exterior softening slightly as he acknowledged Catherine publicly for the first time, elevating her status from servant to his ward, a position that allowed him to show her affection and provide for her future, without explicitly claiming her as his daughter. Eleanor witnessed the transformation with quiet satisfaction, understanding that sometimes the most profound changes came not through grand gestures but through small, daily choices to be more honest, more open, more willing to risk vulnerability for the sake of connection. Then, on a spring morning when the world seemed reborn in shades of green and gold, when flowers bloomed in the castle gardens and birds sang in the trees, a messenger arrived with news that made Eleanor's heart leap into her throat. The war was over, or at least this phase of it, and the English forces were returning home. Lord Ashford's men, including Sir Rowan Steele, were expected to arrive at Castle Greystone within the week. Eleanor spent the following days in a state of anxious anticipation, unable to focus on anything for more than a few minutes before her thoughts returned to Rowan. Was he well? Had he been wounded? Would he still feel the same connection to her after months of separation, or had distance and the harsh realities of war changed his feelings? She prepared and re-prepared her chambers, changed her dress 3 times each morning, and drove poor Catherine to distraction with her nervous energy. On the seventh day, as afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the courtyard, a cry went up from the gatehouse. "Riders approaching! Our men return!" Eleanor rushed to the battlements, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She scanned the approaching column of soldiers, searching desperately for one particular figure among the many. They looked diminished from the proud force that had departed months earlier, their numbers reduced by casualties and their appearance worn and weary from long campaigning. But they rode with their heads high, veterans now, survivors of trials that had tested them to their limits. And there, at the head of the column, sat Rowan on his black stallion, alive and whole, and riding toward home. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face, a mixture of relief and joy so intense it was almost painful. She gathered her skirts and ran, propriety forgotten in her desperate need to reach him, flying downstairs and through corridors until she burst into the courtyard just as the riders were passing through the gates. Rowan saw her immediately, and something fierce and bright flared in his eyes. He dismounted in one fluid motion, armor and weapons forgotten, and strode across the courtyard toward her with long, purposeful steps. They met in the center of the space, surrounded by soldiers and servants and the organized chaos of an army's return, and Rowan swept Eleanor into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around while she laughed and cried simultaneously. "You came back," Eleanor sobbed against his shoulder, her arms wrapped tight around his neck. "You kept your promise. You came back to me. Did you ever doubt I would?" Rowan asked, setting her down gently, but not releasing his hold, as if afraid she might vanish if he let go. "I told you I had something worth surviving for, someone worth coming home to. No French sword or English arrow could keep me from returning to you, Eleanor." They kissed then, there in the courtyard with half the castle watching, a kiss that spoke of months of longing and fear, of hope sustained through darkness, of love tested and proven true. Around them, soldiers cheered and servants applauded, sharing in the joy of reunion, of survival, of the triumph of the human heart over the devastations of war. Lord Ashford approached, Catherine at his side, both smiling at the reunion unfolding before them. "Welcome home, Sir Rowan," the Lord said, his voice warm with genuine pleasure. "I trust the campaign was successful." Rowan reluctantly loosened his embrace of Eleanor, though he kept one arm firmly around her waist, as if to anchor himself to her presence. "As successful as such enterprises can be, my lord. We achieved our objectives, though the cost was high. I have much to report, but if I might beg your indulgence, I would prefer to delay those discussions until tomorrow. Today, I wish only to savor the joy of homecoming and the blessing of being reunited with those I hold dear." "Of course," Lord Ashford agreed easily, a rare smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Take the time you need, Rowan. The reports can wait. Some things are more important than duty, and I am learning, albeit late in life, to recognize what those things are." That evening, as the castle celebrated the army's return with a feast in the great hall, Eleanor and Rowan slipped away from the festivities to find a moment of privacy in the gardens. Spring had transformed the grounds into a wonderland of color and fragrance, with flowers blooming in profusion and new leaves unfurling on every tree and bush. They walked hand in hand along winding paths, stopping occasionally to simply stand together, savoring the miracle of reunion. "I have thought every day of this moment," Rowan confessed as they sat together on a stone bench beneath a flowering apple tree. "In the worst moments of the campaign, when death seemed certain and hope grew thin, I would close my eyes and imagine being here with you, in this garden, at peace and whole and together. That image sustained me through trials I cannot even begin to describe." Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the solid strength of him, the warmth and reality that confirmed he was truly here, not just a dream or desperate fantasy. "I lit a candle for you every night," she told him. "A different candle than the one I used to light for Thomas, though similar in its way. But this time, I was not waiting for the dead to return, but praying for the living to survive. This time my hope was rewarded." Rowan turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Eleanor, I must ask you something, and I need you to answer truthfully, without concern for what you think I wish to hear. These months apart have given us both time to reflect, to consider whether what we felt in those fevered weeks before my departure was genuine or merely the product of heightened emotions and extraordinary circumstances. Do you still feel for me what you felt then? Or has time and distance revealed that our connection was more fragile than we believed?" Eleanor looked into his eyes, those storm-gray depths that had become as familiar to her as her own reflection, and felt the truth of her feelings settle over her like a cloak, warm and comforting and absolutely certain. "I love you, Rowan Steele," she said clearly, speaking the words aloud for the first time. Not despite the distance or the time apart, but in some ways because of it. The separation proved to me that what I feel for you is not fleeting or circumstantial, but deep and enduring and true. I love you as I loved Thomas, though differently, in a way shaped by who we both are and what we have both survived. And I want, if you will have me, to build a life with you, to create something new and beautiful from the ashes of our respective losses. Rowan's face transformed with emotion so raw and powerful that Eleanor felt her own eyes fill with tears in response. "You honor me beyond measure," he said, his voice rough with feeling. "I too love you, Eleanor, with everything I am and everything I hope to become. I want nothing more than to make you my wife, to stand before God and witnesses and pledge myself to you for all the days we are given. Will you marry me, Eleanor Whitmore? Will you take this scarred and imperfect soldier and help him build a life worth living?" "Yes," Eleanor breathed, the word emerging on a sob of pure joy. "Yes, 1,000 times yes. I will marry you, Rowan, and together we will create the future neither of us dared imagine when we were lost in our separate griefs." They sealed the promise with a kiss that tasted of salt and sweetness, of tears and triumph, of endings transformed into beginnings. Around them, the garden bloomed in riotous celebration, and high above in Eleanor's chamber window, a candle burned steadily, its flame no longer a beacon of desperate hope for the impossible, but a symbol of faith rewarded, of love found and claimed and cherished. The wedding took place 3 weeks later, in the castle's chapel, with Lord Ashford giving Eleanor away, and Catherine standing as her attendant. It was a modest ceremony by noble standards, but to Eleanor it was perfect, filled with genuine warmth, and witnessed by people who had come to care for her during her time at Castle Greystone. She wore a gown of cream-colored silk that Lord Ashford had commissioned specially for the occasion, with sleeves lined in fur and embroidery at the bodice in silver thread, her hair crowned with a circlet of spring flowers that Catherine had woven. Rowan stood waiting for her at the altar, resplendent in his finest clothing, his face transformed by a joy so complete it seemed to radiate from him like light. As Eleanor walked down the aisle toward him, she felt the weight of the past finally lift from her shoulders. Not forgotten or discarded, but integrated into who she had become. Her love for Thomas, a part of her history that made her capable of loving Rowan with greater depth and appreciation for the preciousness of such gifts. They spoke their vows in voices that rang clear and true through the chapel, promising to love and honor, to support and cherish, to face together whatever trials and triumphs the future might bring. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, and Rowan kissed her with tender reverence, Eleanor felt something inside her shift and settle, a sense of rightness and completion that she had not experienced since before Thomas's death. The feast that followed lasted well into the night, with music and dancing and celebration that united the entire castle in shared happiness. Lord Ashford made a toast to the couple, speaking of second chances and the courage required to embrace new possibilities, while Catherine's toast spoke of hope and healing, and the transformative power of opening one's heart to love, despite fear of loss. As the evening drew to a close and Eleanor and Rowan prepared to retire to the chambers they would now share, Eleanor took one last look at the candle burning in what had been her window. She thought of the candle she had lit for 3 years in Wintermere, waiting for an impossible miracle, for the dead to return. Now she understood that the true miracle had not been the one she waited for, but rather the one she had stopped waiting for long enough to recognize and embrace. The miracle was not resurrection, but transformation, not the return of what was lost, but the discovery of something new and unexpected and infinitely precious. She extinguished the candle with a gentle breath, no longer needing its light to guide her through the darkness. She had found her way home, not to the past she had mourned, but to a future she had learned to hope for, built on foundations of shared understanding, mutual respect, and a love that had been tested by separation and proven strong enough to weather whatever storms might come. As Eleanor closed the shutters and turned to where Rowan waited for her, his arms open and his eyes filled with love and promise, she realized that she had finally stopped merely existing and had learned to truly live again. The woman who had waited each evening with a candle in her hand for an impossible return had been transformed into someone new, someone who understood that miracles came not in the form we expected, but in the courage to release the past and embrace the future, to risk loss again for the chance at love, to believe that even the deepest grief could be transmuted into profound joy. Together, they stepped into their new life, two people who had found each other in the midst of sorrow and chosen to build something beautiful from the fragments of their broken hearts, proving that love, in all its forms, was the greatest miracle of all.